Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to discuss this paper called The Atrazine Saga and its importance to the future of toxicology, science, and environmental and human health. And what this paper is about is this pesticide atrazine, which is basically a weed killer that farmers spray on their fields, and it kills weeds, therefore allowing their crops to grow better, therefore increasing food supply and profits. It's a very controversial pesticide because, as the title suggests, it has negative effects on the environment, and more recently people have observed negative effects on human health. And despite these negative effects that have been observed, atrazine is still widely used and it's not being properly regulated by regulatory agencies. So we're going to talk about why that is, but basically the company that produces atrazine, which is called Syngenta, they've engaged in many corrupt practices to hide these scientific studies showing negative effects, to try to ruin the reputation of the scientists conducting those studies. And they've also been basically manipulating the EPA to listen to them instead of these scientists and to basically be relaxed on the regulation of atrazine. So the reason that this paper matters is because this is really an example of a broader phenomenon, which is extensive corruption in science. Also, failure of regulatory agencies. Okay, so people have this view that science is like this strict, formal process that can't really be subject to bias because of the method involved. But the reality is there's a lot of ways to manipulate science in a corrupt way. And as these authors call it, bending science. And we're going to talk about some examples of that, and then we're going to also talk about how that applies to more than just atrazine. Okay, this is just a case study of a broader phenomenon, which is corruption in science leading to inaccurate perceptions by the public and failing of regulatory agencies to protect us from harmful chemicals. All right, so just to give some background on atrazine, it was first produced in 1958 for commercial use. And for decades, as we'll see, regulatory agencies were basically saying that it has no negative effects on humans or the environment. And so it went in use for decades, and it was the most common for the longest time. But now it's the second most commonly used pesticide in the United States, behind glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup. Okay, glyphosate also has negative health effects, which we might talk about in future videos. And there's a similar story with glyphosate where the company that produces it has basically engaged in a lot of unethical practices to cover up negative health effects of glyphosate and to make their product look better than it actually is. Okay, but atrazine, it's still very, very commonly used. So there's around 70 million pounds of atrazine are used in the United States annually. Okay, so atrazine is very commonly used and it makes its way into drinking water and surface water. And this is a problem because then, of course, once it enters drinking water, humans drink it and it ends up in our bodies and we're exposed to it. And it's been shown to have many negative effects on humans. Okay, it's also a problem because freshwater creatures, so organisms that just live in the water, they're also exposed to it heavily. And as we'll talk about throughout the paper, one of the atrazine's main negative effects seems to be endocrine disruption in frogs. So in other words, it messes up their sex hormones and their development and even their sexual tendencies, which we'll talk about. Okay, so you might remember when Alex Jones famously said he doesn't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the frogs gay. Okay, atrazine is the chemical he was referring to. Okay, it doesn't turn them gay so much, but it induces hermaphroditism, which is basically when when an organism has both male and female reproductive organs. Okay, so it's disturbing these amphibians, which is significant because they're often endangered and integral to food webs and ecological health. Okay, so basically it negatively affects both humans and the environment. Okay, the reason that the company is so hesitant to admit that atrazine is problematic is because it's very profitable. So the company that produced atrazine was called Syngenta. It's been bought by a different company now, but it was Syngenta, and they made about $2.3 billion annually from its herbicides, and atrazine is the main one. Okay, so of course, they wanted to protect the image of atrazine in the public mind, and of course wanted to prevent it from being regulated by the EPA. So it talks about how Syngenta wanted to protect this product, and the way they did that was through unethical means like smearing researchers who were studying it, intimidating them, and as we'll see, even using corrupt practices to persuade the EPA that atrazine was safe when it really wasn't. All right, so these authors, or this author, he uses the term bending science to refer to basically whenever an individual or a company, they basically misrepresent science through multiple different corrupt mechanisms to support their goals, like economic goals or political goals or ideological goals. So methods of bending science that he refers to include shaping science, which is basically when the person bending science creates research to produce their own desired result. So in the case of Syngenta, that would be like the company of Syngenta paying researchers to do a particular study on their product with the goal of finding that it has no negative effect. Okay. Another mechanism of bending science is to hide science, which we'll see. So that would be like, there's an example of this in this paper, but if the company paid scientists to research their product, and let's say the scientists find that it has a negative health effect, well, Syngenta would then prevent the scientists from publishing that to hide that result from the public. Okay, this goes sort of above that today. So other ways of hiding science in the modern world would be like manipulating internet algorithms to prevent people from finding search results related to certain scientific topics. Okay, so there was a lot of that with, if you remember, the COVID vaccine is probably the best example of that. Okay, social media companies, they hid scientific results related to COVID in order to prevent the public from getting unorthodox views of the virus and the pandemic. Okay. Companies also can engage in harassing or bullying scientists, which we'll talk about. There's a lot of examples of that in this case study. So this would be if the company like reaches out to the university where the scientist works and threatens to withhold funding from the university, or advocating for the university to prevent the scientist from being tenured or advancing in their career. Okay, there's what's called packaging science. And what this is basically whenever a company who's bending science pays a group of experts to like publicly advocate for the product. So we'll go through an example of that here, but Syngenta basically paid a bunch of researchers to write a review article that was favorable of their product. Okay, and then that makes people think, oh, there's all these researchers, all these experts who support this product, therefore I should also support this product. Okay, and all of this sort of contributes to this last one, which is spinning science, which is basically whenever they misrepresent science to the public in order to convince them of a certain outcome. So again, in the case of atrazine, that would be the company basically convincing the public that their product is safe and that that's what the science shows. Okay, so all of these mechanisms of bending science were exemplified in this case study regarding atrazine. So we'll talk about that as we go. Okay, interestingly, the EPA back in 2016, so they finally, after, again, decades of controversy surrounding atrazine, they finally admitted that atrazine has negative effects on various creatures in the environment. And a couple years later, they admitted that it poses risks to humans, especially developing children. And despite that, in 2020, they still continue to allow atrazine to be used, and they give it relaxed regulations. So again, in terms of how agencies prevent toxic chemicals from getting into our environment, it's an uphill battle. You have to spend decades doing research to convince the EPA that something is harmful. And even if you successfully convince them that it's harmful, Okay, they won't even implement regulation. And if they do implement regulation, as we'll see, they fail to actually enforce it. Okay, so there really aren't that many checks and balances in science as people think there are. We are exposed to toxic chemicals all the time, and that's because the system is sort of rigged in their favor. Okay, regulatory agencies assume that all chemicals are harmless until proven harmful rather than the other way around. And you have to demonstrate with overwhelming evidence that something is harmful. And sometimes even that's not enough. Okay, so there's a lot of corruption, and regulatory agencies do not do a good job of protecting people from toxic chemicals. All right, so we're going to go through this part briefly. So he talks about some of the negative effects of atrazine on amphibians. We're not as interested personally in amphibians as we are humans. Okay, so we'll keep this part brief, but basically he goes on to talk about how many researchers have documented negative effects on amphibians, mostly negative effects on their fertility and causing hormonal problems among the amphibians. And there's some more effects also, like it worsens their immune function, makes them more susceptible to infection, and makes them more likely to be subjected to predation also. So basically, it seriously damages many different amphibian populations. But it's worth emphasizing that the real concern is as it relates to humans. Okay, humans are also suffering from a health decline in developed societies. So, autoimmune diseases are increasing, chronic diseases are increasing, metabolic diseases are increasing, endocrine-related problems are increasing, infertility is increasing. So we're not becoming more healthy, we're actually becoming a lot less healthy. And one of the main explanations for that that's gaining popularity is that we're exposed to toxic chemicals pretty much all the time everywhere. Okay, atrazine, again, that's just one of many examples of toxic chemicals, like tens of thousands of toxic chemicals in our environment. Okay, so he goes on to, like I said, he talks a lot about its negative effects on amphibians. One important point is that the effects are not necessarily linearly related to the dose. In other words, it's not the case that if you give an amphibian a low dose of atrazine and then a high dose of atrazine, that it has a worse effect at the higher dose. The relationship between the dose of atrazine and the effect is not always linear. Sometimes lower doses have worse health effects. Sometimes higher doses have worse health effects. All right, and so this is just important to highlight because regarding like toxicity testing, when you're testing whether or not a chemical is toxic, you'd have to test it at every conceivable concentration in order to fully understand its health effects. Okay, so scientists, they might want to just test it at a few different concentrations and then try to generalize their conclusions to all concentrations. But the fact that they have nonlinear effects means you can't do that. You truly, if you're going to do safety testing properly, you would have to test a given chemical's health effects at like every conceivable concentration. And to make matters worse, you'd also have to test every possible health effect at every possible concentration. So that's impossible to do. So safety testing is always insufficient to claim that something is safe. So again, if you ever hear somebody say that science has proven that a certain chemical or a medication is safe, you need to question that because safety testing, it's limited by practicality, and what you would truly need to do in order to prove that something is safe is an enormous amount of testing that's not really feasible. Okay, and it's also worth mentioning before we get on that all of these concepts, they apply to more than just pesticides. So that should be obvious, but it applies to other pollutants in our environment or other toxins in our environment, like plasticizers that are used to make plastics or flame retardants that are put in furniture or things like that. But also a lot of these conclusions apply to like the pharmaceutical industry too. So that's a big one. So scientists will claim that a certain medication has been proven to be safe. But again, they haven't done all the necessary testing to make that claim. Because you'd have to test many different concentrations, many different health effects, and it's not possible to do all that. So at the very least, they should be making a softer claim. Okay, so next they start to talk about the timeline of the atrazine controversy. So remember, this chemical was released in 1958. It wasn't until 40 years later, in 1998, when the controversy surrounding its health effects really took off. So that's 4 decades of widespread spraying of this pesticide and exposure of people all across the country to this pesticide. And only now, or at this point, did they start to realize it might have negative health effects. And as we're going to see, it took decades even from that for the EPA to admit there was a problem. And even that's not enough, because even today, atrazine is still one of the most commonly used pesticides in America. Okay, but the controversy started when this professor, Dr. Tyrone Hayes, this researcher, was basically hired by Syngenta to study atrazine. Okay, more specifically, Syngenta, again, it's the company that produces atrazine. They have this consulting company they're affiliated with called EcoRisk, and EcoRisk hired Dr. Hayes to study atrazine. And you might think that sounds benevolent on the part of Syngenta, like, oh, they're trying to study their compound to make sure it's not harmful. But in reality, this contract that they had with Dr. Hayes, it basically said that Hayes was not allowed to publish any results that were Syngenta funded without Syngenta's permission. So in other words, Syngenta was studying this presumably because they just wanted to see negative findings. They wanted to see that it had no negative health effects. And if any positive findings were obtained, and if any negative health effects were observed, they were going to prevent that from being published in academic journals. So basically, they were stifling the publication of any negative findings. Okay? And that's a problem because very quickly, Hayes found out that atrazine had negative effects. So as it says here, while he was working for Syngenta, he found out that atrazine was inducing hermaphroditism, which again, that's having both male and female sex organs, and that was happening in frogs. Okay, so we're going to skip this box. It basically gives a breakdown of the timeline of the main events here. But despite Hayes' findings about the hermaphroditism, EcoRisk blocked him from publishing that. So again, they said publication of findings is based on mutual consent between Syngenta and Hayes, and Syngenta didn't consent because, of course, why would they? This is an extremely profitable pesticide. They don't want the public to know that it has negative effects on the environment. So they reminded him that these results are confidential. Hayes should not be spreading these results. Okay, well, at this, Hayes essentially cut ties with Syngenta, so he left. And he went on to do independent research at his university on atrazine, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, but whenever he left Syngenta and EcoRisk, he says that Syngenta threatened his university, Berkeley. Syngenta threatened to take all their funding away that was related to Syngenta or Syngenta's sister company, Novartis, which is basically a pharmaceutical company. Okay, so in other words, Syngenta and their sister company, Novartis, they provided funding to Berkeley for other reasons besides just to study atrazine. And whenever Hayes found negative effects of atrazine and then left Syngenta whenever he was mad that they wouldn't let him publish his findings, they threatened his university. Okay? They said, if Berkeley tenures Hayes, then they would prevent all of this funding. Okay. To their credit, Berkeley tenured Hayes anyway. Okay, so they continue the story and they say that Hayes, after leaving Syngenta, he went on to study atrazine independently without Syngenta funding at Berkeley, and he found many of the same results, so many negative effects on amphibians. And while you would think this would make the EPA want to regulate atrazine, Syngenta basically paid a bunch of attorneys to prevent the EPA from considering Hayes' work. So more specifically, Syngenta paid a group of attorneys to look through the laws about like regulation of chemicals and things like that. And what they found is that regulatory agencies are not allowed to consider scientific findings for which there is no established standards. So in other words, there's no specific standards for how to assess endocrine disruption in science. And so because there's no like established standards, the EPA was not allowed to consider Hayes' research whenever deciding whether or not atrazine was harmful and should be allowed to be used. Okay, so this is an example where, Syngenta was basically paying attorneys to find and exploit a technicality within an obscure law in order to prevent a toxic chemical from being properly regulated. Okay, so again, laws are being manipulated to protect toxic chemicals that harm our population rather than to protect the population. It's another clear example of corruption in our society. Okay, down here, there's another interesting part, which is that the head of EcoRisk that was investigating atrazine was also a member of the EPA's advisory board that was involved in making the decision to register atrazine. So in other words, during this time, atrazine was being reassessed to see if it should be approved for continued use. And one of the people involved in the EPA's decision regarding atrazine, whether it should be allowed to be used or not, he was also involved in the EcoRisk, which is that Syngenta-associated company that was investigating atrazine. So obvious conflict of interest, yet that's just the way it is in our society. People who are in the regulatory agencies are also often involved in companies that they're trying to regulate. So a lot of conflicts of interest. Okay, it goes on to continue the story. So Dr. Hayes was then offered a job at Duke. But after Duke made that job offer, Syngenta basically reached out to Duke and pressured them to withdraw their offer. So they did that to protect their reputation, of course. So they don't want this Dr. Hayes to move up in the world and to advance in his career. So they were thwarting that. Okay, so that just goes to show you that, some of these very wealthy companies have a lot of power even over universities. So they can pressure these universities using their finances to do things and to influence how they treat their faculty. Okay, so another example of corruption. Let's see. So then, numerous lawsuits were being launched against the EPA and against Syngenta during this time over atrazine, one of which found that EPA and Syngenta were meeting privately. They'd met privately over 40 times to evaluate the toxicity of atrazine without any sort of, hostile witness in there. Nobody against atrazine was allowed in to these private meetings. Okay. Later on, Hayes, he basically published a report saying that whether or not a study was funded by Syngenta is the main determinant of whether it finds atrazine has a negative health effect or not. So, in other words, the Syngenta-funded studies, they don't show negative health effects of atrazine as often, whereas independent studies that are not funded by Syngenta, they do tend to find negative health effects. Okay, so this clearly, Syngenta is funding and conducting biased science in favor of their product. Where it really gets interesting is, it says down here, Syngenta started a smear campaign against Hayes. And this one's crazy, but they ended up buying internet search results for his name. So that way they would be the first results that people would see when they looked up Dr. Tyrone Haynes. So that way they could, again, tarnish his reputation and try and ruin his image in the public light. Okay? And that was all revealed in documents obtained during a lawsuit later on. Okay, as people started to become more aware of the negative effects of atrazine, Syngenta basically paid a bunch of scientists to write a review article that was favorable to atrazine. So they talk about that article here, but they paid a bunch of scientists, this Solomon et al., to basically write a positive review of their product. But as this author who's writing the current paper says, they basically misrepresented atrazine, and so he and his postdoctoral researcher basically spent a few years carefully evaluating that review article, and as we're going to talk about, they found that they misrepresented atrazine significantly in that Syngenta-funded review article. And this part here is also interesting. So as the negative health effects of atrazine became more popular, publications like the New York Times started doing investigative journalism on this. And as it says here, they reported that tens of millions of Americans are exposed to atrazine through drinking water, and that contamination exceeded federal limit in 9 of 10 Midwestern states. So in other words, the EPA sets a limit for how much atrazine is considered safe in the water supply. And basically everywhere is over that limit. So it doesn't even matter that they set a safety limit. It's exceeding that limit. And they don't do anything to enforce it. At least they don't do enough to enforce it. And it says here that for several of these states, levels were 9 to 18 times higher than the federal limit. In other words, way more atrazine is found in the drinking water than is supposed to be there according to the EPA's safety limits. Okay, but again, there's no enforcement of regulation here. And as we'll talk about more later, this excessive amount of atrazine, that's been linked to birth defects, premature birth, and low birth weight in humans. Okay, so it seems to be negatively affecting the human populations in these areas. And despite all of this, atrazine is still widely used today. Okay, so remember this, the author who's writing this current paper, they basically assessed that Syngenta-funded review article by Solomon et al. And what they found is that that review article misrepresented a significant number of the studies. So we're not going to really get into the details of those two articles here, but basically they were misrepresenting some of the studies, making misleading statements, in some cases making outright inaccurate statements, and ignoring certain results and promoting others. Okay, so these authors basically then published that counter response to that review article, talking about all of its flaws. And they also talked about the controversy, and they had trouble getting that published because, again, journal editors, like academic journals, they have editors that make decisions about what papers get approved for publication. Well, a lot of those times they are also biased or influenced by companies, and they had trouble getting their papers published. So that's another way that science can be hidden from the public, is if journal editors won't allow the paper to be published in their journals. Okay, so then this author, again, he goes on to talk about how in 2010, he gave a seminar on atrazine at Illinois State University, and Syngenta basically sent attorneys there to record it and take notes, presumably to try and sue him, or at the very least to intimidate him into silence. Okay, and the university that he was speaking at had to hire security for him. Okay, and they had to check the recording devices on the attorneys. So again, that's just another example of intimidation by Syngenta. Right? The only reason they would send an attorney to a talk is to make the presenter fear that they're going to be sued. Okay, so he goes on to talk about how when he does his own research, he does so with a collaborator at this Florida's Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. Okay, it's a center where he has his tank, his outdoor tank, where he performs these experiments using atrazine. And what he said is that when he started talking and getting public about the negative effects of atrazine, Syngenta basically pressured this center to prevent him from working there anymore. So in other words, he works at this center and does his experiments there. Well, Syngenta pressured that center to cut ties with his collaborator. He was forced out of a job there. And this researcher tried to get other collaborators at that center so he could keep his experiments going. But Syngenta and that center basically prevented that from happening. So again, this is another example of hiding research and outright blocking research by preventing this guy from even getting access to his tank where he conducts his research. Okay. But that Dr. Hayes continued to go on and research more of the negative effects of atrazine. And this is just interesting. One of the results that he found is that he exposed laboratory population of all genetically male frogs to low levels of atrazine and showed that these males suffered from depressed testosterone, decreased breeding gland size, feminized laryngeal development, suppressed mating behavior, reduced spermatogenesis, and decreased fertility. In addition, 10% of these atrazine-exposed males developed into functional females that copulated with unexposed males. So in other words, these male frogs are basically being feminized. Okay, Now that's a problem because, again, if you consider this in humans, in human populations, we're experiencing massively decreased testosterone levels. Fertility rates are declining also. Spermatogenesis is problematic in a lot of people. Okay, we have a fertility issue. So it's probably the case that a lot of these endocrine disruptors are negatively affecting humans as well. So as he emphasizes, one of the biggest problems with atrazine is not so much Syngenta, because you expect a company to want to protect their product and to be a little bit corrupt in doing so. The bigger issue is the EPA, which is basically complicit in Syngenta's corruption. Okay, so that's an important point. Again, the regulatory agencies, they're not protecting you. It's quite the opposite. They're protecting the companies that are harming you. Okay, so then he goes on to talk about some of the unethical practices that Syngenta was using to smear Dr. Hayes. So this was all obtained from a Freedom of Information Act request, where they got like 1,000 pages of memos, emails, and notes talking about some of the tactics Syngenta was using to target Dr. Hayes. Okay, so it says that the subpoena documents revealed that Syngenta was indeed behind a campaign to smear him and his reputation, and that their strategy was to purchase Tyrone Hayes as a search word on the internet, so that anytime someone searches for Tyrone's material, the first thing they see is our material. In other words, they wanted people to see what they had to say about Tyrone so they could smear his reputation. They later also purchased the phrases amphibian, haze, atrazine frogs, and frog feminization. Again, they purchased those search results, that way they could mislead the public about those. Okay? Trying to make Tyrone Hayes seem like a crazy person and trying to make all of this seem like a conspiracy theory. Okay, so it says other tactics in the document directed at Hayes included commissioning a psychological profile, have his work audited by a third party, ask journalists to retract, which we'll talk about in a minute, set trap to entice him to sue, investigate funding, investigate wife, tracking him at speaking engagements, baiting him through emails, and interfering with Hayes' job offer at Duke, which we talked about. Okay, so regarding retraction, so I don't know if this is specifically what they're referring to in this case, but paper retraction is another strategy that activists use to try to prevent certain scientific findings from getting out to the public, which is if an academic journal does publish a result that the activist doesn't like, then they demand that the journal basically retract that paper, which means pull it from publication. That happens a lot with like social science, okay? Maybe we'll talk about some of those papers in future videos, but a lot of controversial social science regarding like gender or race and things like that, it gets retracted because of activism pressuring journals and journal editors to pull those papers from their website. Okay, so that was apparently what Syngenta was also doing with atrazine papers. All right, next it says, the subpoenaed documents unveiled a multi-million-dollar campaign which not only included discrediting and distracting Hayes, but also hiring detectives to investigate scientists on a federal advisory panel, looking into the personal life of a judge, and keeping a list of 130 people and groups it could recruit as experts, including academics, without disclosing ties to the company. Okay, so a lot of obvious corruption in there. Another thing they would do is they would pay people to write op-eds supporting atrazine and saying that it was safe. And even though these people were being paid by Syngenta, they looked like an unbiased expert to the population. So it's another clear case where they're manipulating the population's perception, in this case by basically hiring people to tell the population that Syngenta's product is perfect. Okay. There's another example where the EPA was evaluating atrazine, and they said it has no effects on the frogs, but they only looked at a single study that was funded by Syngenta. They said that all the other studies were not reliable. So at this point, there were hundreds of other studies that they could have looked at, but they only looked at one to make this conclusion, and it was a Syngenta-funded study, which were all biased. Okay. During this evaluation of atrazine, it says the EPA also overlooked important peer-reviewed studies on atrazine in human health, such as statistically significant associations between atrazine's presence in drinking water and preterm births. Okay. restricted fetal growth, small head circumference in babies whose mothers drank atrazine-contaminated tap water during the first trimester of pregnancy, and an elevated risk of genital malformations among male children born to mothers who lived in counties with frequent atrazine spraying. According to other investigative reporting, the agency dismissed or ignored more than 10 human epidemiological studies showing human health harm from atrazine in drinking water, and data showing that atrazine can change brain function and behavior, can affect child development, and poses a cancer risk. So all of those negative effects were basically ignored by the EPA also. Okay, so the EPA, for decades, the EPA basically said that atrazine was safe. And then finally, all the way now in 2016, they basically admit that atrazine does seem to have negative effects on various aquatic animals and mammals, like humans. Okay. So they admit all of that by 2018 and 2016. But now they still have relaxed regulations on atrazine, and in 2020, the regulations changed to allow 50% more atrazine to enter water bodies. So that's basically the paper in a nutshell. It really exemplifies the corruption in science. Again, if you're under the impression, if you're one of those people who is like a trust the science person who's under the impression that science is infallible because it has this rigid method that it follows and there's no room for people's biases to creep in, okay, that's a silly belief system. Atrazine is just one case study that shows that that belief system is foolish. But you could apply that to much more than just atrazine. Okay, so pharmaceutical companies, they engage in extensive corruption. Maybe we'll talk about some of that in future videos. Okay, it also applies to a lot of social science, again, regarding controversial issues like race or gender and things like that. Oftentimes, science is not reliable on those issues. So there's a lot of corruption in science, and science isn't always to be trusted. So thank you for listening.